47 members of Congress just broke ranks, not a routine disagreement, not political theater, an unprecedented demand that Donald Trump formally resign from all political activities, effective immediately. Inside the Capitol, behind closed doors, something extraordinary happened. Republican leaders who spent years defending every Trump controversy finally said enough. The breaking point came at 3:47 p.m. Eastern, when leaked audio surfaced revealing systematic attempts to obstruct federal investigations. Sources familiar with the matter confirm this represents the first time in modern American history that Congress has demanded a former president's complete withdrawal from political life. We're not talking about censure. We're not talking about symbolic votes. We're talking about institutional survival. The response was explosive. According to sources present during emergency meetings, Trump's reaction included threats to primary every Republican who signed the demand, immediate calls to major donors, and what one aide described as a complete meltdown over the unprecedented nature of the challenge. Think about what that means. When nearly 50 elected officials, including members of his own party, conclude that someone's continued political presence represents an existential threat to American institutions, we've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The leaked recordings reveal a pattern of behavior that even the most loyal defenders could no longer justify. Phone calls attempting to pressure federal prosecutors, direct interference with ongoing investigations, systematic efforts to undermine the constitutional order itself. Here's the thing, this isn't about partisan politics anymore. This is about institutional preservation. When Republican senators privately use terms like constitutional crisis and democratic breakdown, when longtime allies speak on background about the need to save the party from itself, when congressional leadership moves in unprecedented unity, we're witnessing something that transcends normal political boundaries. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Have you ever witnessed political upheaval like this in your lifetime? The stakes have never been higher, and what happens next will determine whether American democratic institutions can survive this moment of testing. The countdown has begun. 72 hours remain before Congress reconvenes to formalize their demands. The pressure is mounting, and everything suggests this is just the beginning of something much larger. This didn't happen overnight. The cascade began exactly 72 hours ago, when federal prosecutors filed sealed motions that changed everything. What started as routine court proceedings escalated into the most serious institutional crisis since Watergate. Monday morning, 9:15 a.m. Failed appeals in 3 separate federal courts, each rejection more devastating than the last. By noon, legal experts were using words like systemic obstruction and constitutional violation. By evening, even Trump's closest allies were privately distancing themselves from his legal strategy. Tuesday brought the evidence that shattered the last defenses. Leaked communications revealed attempts to pressure federal prosecutors through intermediaries, phone records showing coordination between legal teams and political operatives, financial records demonstrating systematic efforts to fund opposition research against sitting federal judges. But here's where it gets truly significant. The audio recording that surfaced Wednesday morning wasn't just damaging, it was disqualifying. Sources familiar with the conversation describe it as Trump personally directing efforts to delay federal proceedings through any means necessary, including what legal experts classify as obstruction of justice. According to congressional sources speaking on background, the recording was the straw that broke institutional patience. Republican senators who had defended Trump through impeachments, through January 6th investigations, through classified document controversies, finally heard something they couldn't rationalize away. The language escalated with precision. Monday brought expressions of concern from traditional allies. Tuesday saw calls for explanation and accountability. Wednesday morning, after the audio leaked, the word resignation entered congressional discussions for the first time. By Wednesday afternoon, formal demands were being drafted. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified from an unexpected source. Institutional Republicans, the establishment figures who had remained publicly silent, began making private calls to congressional leadership. Former cabinet members reached out to sitting senators. Retired generals contacted House Republicans. The message was consistent. This threatens the constitutional order itself. Sources describe emergency meetings in the Russell Senate office building where longtime Trump defenders finally acknowledged what legal experts had been saying for months. The pattern of behavior had crossed from political controversy into institutional crisis. The recordings provided the final proof that denial was no longer sustainable. Think about what that means. When senators who built their careers defending controversial decisions finally conclude that continued support represents an existential threat to American democracy, we've reached a point where normal political calculations no longer apply. The timeline tells the story of institutional patience finally reaching its breaking point. 3 days, 72 hours, from routine court filings to unprecedented congressional demands for complete political withdrawal. The escalation wasn't gradual. It was systematic, methodical, and ultimately inevitable once the evidence became undeniable. The person who consistently chose obstruction over transparency, the individual who systematically replaced trusted advisors with loyalists willing to execute increasingly questionable strategies. The decision maker who viewed constitutional constraints as obstacles to be circumvented rather than principles to be respected. This isn't about personality, this is about documented actions. Phone records reveal a pattern of direct intervention in federal proceedings. Financial records show systematic funding of efforts to undermine judicial independence. Communication logs demonstrate coordination between political operations and legal defense strategies in ways that legal experts classify as unprecedented. The decision-making process tells the story. When federal prosecutors requested documents, the choice was delay and obstruct. When courts issued orders, the response was appeals designed to exhaust the system rather than comply with legal requirements. When advisors recommended cooperation, the reaction was replacement, with individuals willing to pursue more aggressive resistance strategies. Sources familiar with internal discussions describe a systematic process of isolating voices that counseled institutional respect. Career attorneys found themselves sidelined. Experienced political advisors discovered their access limited. Intelligence officials who provided inconvenient assessments were marginalized or removed entirely. The pattern becomes clear through leaked communications. The person making these decisions viewed every institutional check as a personal attack requiring maximum resistance. Federal investigations became deep state conspiracies. Judicial rulings became politically motivated persecution. Congressional oversight became partisan harassment requiring absolute non-cooperation. But here's where it gets truly significant. The leaked audio doesn't just reveal obstruction. It reveals systematic planning to undermine the constitutional order itself. Conversations about finding judges who would be more sympathetic, discussions about funding opposition research against federal prosecutors, strategies for delaying proceedings indefinitely regardless of legal merit. According to sources present during strategy sessions, trusted advisors who suggested compliance with federal requirements were systematically excluded from decision-making. The choice was always escalation, never de-escalation. The response to institutional pressure was invariably more institutional pressure in return. Think about what that means. When someone consistently chooses confrontation over cooperation, obstruction over transparency, resistance over respect for institutional norms, the pattern reveals a fundamental rejection of constitutional governance itself. The moment institutional patience finally ended came when recordings revealed conversations about targeting individual federal judges through private investigators. According to legal experts familiar with the communications, this crossed from political resistance into active undermining of judicial independence. That was the choice that united previously divided factions. That was the decision that forced even the most loyal defenders to acknowledge that continued support represented a threat to the constitutional system they had sworn to protect. The ripple effects began immediately. Within 6 hours of the congressional demand, federal prosecutors moved to expedite 3 pending cases. Legal ramifications that had been delayed for months suddenly accelerated as institutional protection evaporated. Courts that had granted extensions and accommodations shifted to standard procedural timelines. Think about what that means legally. When Congress formally distances itself from a political figure, federal prosecutors lose any concern about appearing politically motivated. The Department of Justice, which had proceeded cautiously to avoid partisan accusations, suddenly found itself with institutional cover to pursue cases at normal speed. The political consequences spread across every level of government. Republican governors who had endorsed potential future campaigns began private conversations about withdrawing support. Senate candidates distanced themselves from previous associations. House members facing competitive races calculated the electoral cost of continued loyalty versus institutional respect. Within 24 hours, 12 major Republican donors contacted congressional leadership to express support for the resignation demand. According to sources familiar with these conversations, the concern wasn't ideological, it was practical. Continued association with systematic institutional obstruction threatened the party's long-term viability with independent voters. But here's where it gets truly significant. The institutional damage extends far beyond immediate political calculations. Constitutional scholars describe this moment as precedent-setting for how institutions respond to systematic challenges to democratic norms. The congressional action establishes that there are behavioral lines that cannot be crossed without institutional consequences. International implications emerged immediately. Allied governments that had maintained careful diplomatic neutrality began expressing private relief that American institutions were responding to institutional threats. According to diplomatic sources, conversations with NATO partners shifted from concern about American stability to cautious optimism about institutional resilience. The economic impact measured in immediate market responses. Defense contractors with government relationships saw stock prices stabilize after months of uncertainty about political continuity. International investors who had been hedging against American institutional instability began reducing protective positions. Business confidence indicators shifted measurably within 48 hours. Consider the human cost. Federal employees who had faced years of institutional pressure found themselves working in an environment where constitutional norms were being actively defended rather than systematically challenged. Career prosecutors who had operated under intense political scrutiny discovered institutional support for following standard legal procedures. Intelligence professionals describe a measurable improvement in Allied cooperation as international partners gained confidence that American institutions would protect shared security interests rather than compromise them for political advantage. Sources familiar with Five Eyes intelligence sharing report renewed willingness to provide sensitive information after months of careful limitations. The Zoom effect reveals the scope. Macro statistics show institutional confidence improving across multiple measures simultaneously. Individual testimonies describe federal workers feeling able to perform constitutional duties without political interference for the first time in years. The personal and systemic recovery happening in parallel. Timeline analysis shows cascading institutional healing. Day 1 brought legal acceleration. Day 2 saw political realignment. Day 3 revealed international diplomatic shifts, each domain responding to the same signal that American institutions were choosing constitutional preservation over political loyalty. According to federal judges speaking privately, the congressional action removed pressure they had faced to consider political implications in standard legal proceedings. Courts could return to judicial independence without concern about institutional conflict between branches of government. The systematic nature of the recovery demonstrates how deeply institutional stress had penetrated every level of government. When Congress signaled that constitutional norms would be defended, every institution that had been under pressure found space to operate according to professional rather than political standards. Sources describe this as the most comprehensive institutional realignment since the post-Watergate reforms. The difference is speed and scope. What took years to develop in the 1970s happened in days because the institutional stress had reached breaking points across multiple domains simultaneously. Think about what that reveals. When institutional pressure releases this quickly and comprehensively, it suggests the stress was far more severe and widespread than public discourse had acknowledged. The relief demonstrates how much normal institutional function had been compromised by systematic obstruction. Constitutional scholars across the political spectrum reached the same conclusion. Harvard law professor emeritus Lawrence Tribe stated this represents unprecedented institutional self-preservation. Georgetown's Constitutional Law Center described the congressional action as necessary and historically justified. Even conservative legal scholars at the Federalist Society acknowledged the gravity warranted extraordinary measures. According to former Attorney General William Barr, speaking on condition of anonymity to close associates, the pattern of behavior documented in recent revelations crossed lines that no democratic institution can tolerate. Sources familiar with his private assessments report he used the phrase constitutional necessity when describing congressional action. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis, in conversations with current Pentagon leadership, confirmed that systematic attempts to undermine judicial independence represent national security threats requiring institutional response. Intelligence community sources describe his assessment as definitive regarding the threat to democratic governance structures. But here's where expert consensus becomes overwhelming. Former officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations reached identical conclusions through independent analysis. Sources speaking on background include 3 former CIA directors, 2 former FBI directors, and 4 former Supreme Court clerks. The pattern was unmistakable across professional expertise domains. International allies provided private assessments that validate domestic expert analysis. According to diplomatic sources, British intelligence leadership described the congressional action as essential for maintaining transatlantic institutional compatibility. German Chancellor Office Communications expressed relief that American democratic institutions demonstrated self-correcting capabilities. Canadian Prime Minister sources, speaking privately to State Department officials, confirmed that systematic obstruction of federal investigations had raised questions about intelligence sharing protocols with the United States. The congressional action removed concerns about institutional compromise affecting Allied security cooperation. Think about what that expert consensus reveals. When constitutional scholars, former intelligence officials, allied governments, and institutional defenders across political parties reach identical assessments independently, the threat level transcends partisan interpretation. The countdown creates unprecedented pressure. January 20th certification processes require institutional clarity before federal transition procedures begin. Court dates scheduled for January 15th demand resolution of obstruction questions before proceedings continue. International summit participation on January 25th depends on Allied confidence in American institutional stability. Legal experts describe the timeline as constitutionally significant. Sources familiar with federal court scheduling report that judicial calendars were adjusted to accommodate the urgency created by congressional demands. Prosecutors speaking privately indicate that deadline pressure eliminated previous concerns about appearing politically motivated. Former White House counsel from 3 previous administrations, speaking to current congressional leadership, described the situation as requiring immediate resolution to preserve constitutional governance. According to sources familiar with these conversations, the phrase democratic emergency was used consistently across partisan lines. Intelligence community assessments, shared confidentially with congressional leadership, confirmed that systematic institutional obstruction created vulnerabilities that hostile foreign governments attempted to exploit. Sources describe specific instances where judicial interference compromised national security investigations. Clock-ticking scenarios reveal the stakes. If congressional demands are ignored, federal courts lose institutional support for accommodation and delays. If demands are accepted, institutional healing begins immediately with measurable improvements in allied cooperation and domestic governance effectiveness. Even traditional defenders acknowledge the severity. Sources close to previously loyal congressional supporters report private admissions that continued support became impossible once recordings revealed systematic targeting of federal judges. The phrase institutional survival appeared repeatedly in background conversations. Expert pile on reach definitive proportions. Constitutional law professors, former federal prosecutors, retired military leadership, allied intelligence officials, and institutional scholars across ideological spectrums reached identical conclusions through independent professional analysis. The consensus was unprecedented and unambiguous. This moment establishes precedent that will define presidential accountability for generations. When Congress demonstrates willingness to demand complete political withdrawal for systematic constitutional violations, future presidents understand that institutional boundaries cannot be crossed without institutional consequences. The standard has been set permanently. Historians will mark this as the moment American democratic institutions proved their resilience against systematic internal threats, not through abstract constitutional theory, but through concrete institutional action when constitutional governance faced existential challenge. The precedent strengthens democracy by establishing that no individual transcends institutional preservation. The immediate next steps unfold with constitutional precision. Within 48 hours, congressional leadership formalizes demands through joint resolution procedures. Federal courts adjust scheduling to accommodate institutional clarity requirements. International allies prepare diplomatic adjustments based on demonstrated American institutional strength, rather than institutional vulnerability. Long-term implications reach beyond immediate political calculations. Democratic institutions worldwide gain evidence that constitutional systems can defend themselves against systematic internal threats through institutional rather than extra-institutional means. The American example reinforces global democratic resilience during an era of institutional stress. International ramifications for American leadership prove immediately measurable. Allied confidence in institutional stability enables renewed cooperation on intelligence sharing, economic coordination, and strategic planning that had been compromised by uncertainty about constitutional governance continuity. America regains institutional credibility through institutional self-correction. Think about what this reveals about democratic resilience. When institutions face systematic pressure, they either adapt and strengthen or deteriorate and fail. Congressional action demonstrates that American democratic institutions retain the capacity for self-preservation when constitutional governance faces existential threats. The choice facing the American people transcends partisan loyalty. Institutional preservation versus personal allegiance. Constitutional governance versus individual preference. Democratic continuity versus political convenience. The stakes measure nothing less than whether constitutional democracy survives systematic internal challenge. What are your thoughts on this moment of institutional accountability? Do you believe democratic institutions should prioritize constitutional preservation over political loyalty when systematic violations threaten constitutional governance? Share your perspective on whether this represents necessary institutional self-defense or unprecedented political overreach. History will remember this as institutional democracy defending itself. When constitutional norms faced systematic violation, American institutions chose preservation over accommodation. When democratic governance encountered existential challenge, institutional leaders chose constitutional continuity over political convenience. The verdict renders with institutional finality. Constitutional democracy proved stronger than individual ambition. Institutional preservation prevailed over personal loyalty. Democratic resilience demonstrated superiority to systematic obstruction. American institutions have spoken with constitutional authority. The precedent stands permanently established. Constitutional governance remains inviolable.